Most towns have a welcome sign at the city limits. These ones have something considerably less welcoming: guards, fences, classified designations, or a government that would prefer you didn't know the town existed at all. These are 10 forbidden towns you're not supposed to know. Number 10. Ozyorsk, Russia. Ozyorsk is a closed city in the Chelyabinsk Oblast of Russia, about 90 miles south of Yekaterinburg in the southern Ural Mountains, and it exists for one reason: the Mayak Production Association, a nuclear facility that was one of the Soviet Union's primary plutonium production sites during the Cold War. The town was built to house the workers and their families at Mayak, beginning in the late 1940s. And the Soviet government went to considerable lengths to keep both the facility and the town's existence off any public record for decades. On official Soviet maps, the area was simply blank. The Mayak facility has the distinction of being the site of the Kishtim disaster, which occurred on September 29, 1957, when a cooling system failure caused a chemical explosion in one of the nuclear waste storage tanks, releasing an estimated 70 to 80 tons of radioactive material into the atmosphere. The explosion was rated at level 6 on the International Nuclear Event Scale, the third most serious nuclear accident ever recorded, behind Chernobyl at level 7 and Fukushima also at level 7. The Soviet government covered up the event completely. No official acknowledgement was made until 1990, more than 3 decades after it happened, and the population in the contaminated area, the East Ural radioactive trace, had no information about what had occurred or why they were being relocated from certain villages in the days following the explosion. Access to Ozyorsk remains restricted today under Russian law. It is classified as a Zato, a closed administrative territorial formation, which means entry requires a special permit issued by the Federal Security Service, and foreign nationals are essentially never granted access regardless of their stated purpose. The city has a population of around 80,000 people, its own full city infrastructure including shopping centers, schools, cultural facilities, and a functioning economy tied entirely to the nuclear industry. People who live there were born into a closed world and largely remain in it across generations, which is either a deeply Soviet-era phenomenon persisting stubbornly into the present or a reasonably ordinary example of people building lives close to their work. The radioactive legacy of what happened in 1957 is still being managed in the Techa River watershed downstream of Mayak, where contamination has been documented by Russian and international researchers for decades, and cleanup operations continue without a defined completion date. Number 9. Zhukovsky, Russia. Zhukovsky is another Russian Zato, located about 40 kilometers southeast of Moscow, and unlike Ozyorsk, its closure has nothing to do with radioactivity. Zhukovsky exists around the Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, known by its Russian acronym TSAGI, and the Gromov Flight Research Institute, which have been the primary facilities for Soviet and Russian aeronautical research and aircraft testing since the 1920s. Virtually every significant Soviet and Russian military aircraft of the 20th century was tested in the skies above Zhukovsky before entering production. The town developed around these research facilities through the Soviet era, and access was restricted because the work being done there was among the most sensitive military technology development in the country. Entire generations of Soviet aeronautical engineers and test pilots lived their professional lives in Zhukovsky, testing aircraft whose existence the outside world would not learn about for years or decades. The MiG and Sukhoi fighter families were refined there, and experimental aircraft programs that never reached production were tested, classified, and buried in Zhukovsky's institutional memory. The facility was also home to the Tu-144, the Soviet supersonic passenger aircraft that competed directly with the Anglo-French Concorde during the 1970s, and whose flight test program was managed from the Gromov Institute's facilities. The MAX Air Show, the Moscow Aerospace Show, has been held at Zhukovsky's Ramenskoye Airport periodically since 1993, which introduced the outside world to the facility's existence and gradually loosened some of the restrictions around civilian access to the surrounding town. The town was officially reclassified from a full Zato to a restricted settlement with somewhat more permeable access rules in 2009. Today, it has a population of around 100,000 people and officially exists on maps, though its research facilities remain classified and access to the flight test infrastructure requires credentials that most people will never hold. The town went from state secret to something approaching a commuter suburb of Moscow in the space of about 20 years, which says something about how quickly geopolitical priorities can reframe what counts as a secret worth keeping and what counts as an air show venue. Number 8. Ramea, Newfoundland, Canada. Ramea is a small island community off the southwest coast of Newfoundland with a population of around 500 people, accessible only by ferry from the Burgeo area, and it is not forbidden in the governmental or military sense. Nobody is going to arrest you for trying to get there. What makes Ramea effectively forbidden is a combination of weather, logistics, and the specific kind of remoteness that the Canadian maritime environment specializes in producing. The ferry service connecting Ramea to the mainland runs on a schedule that the weather frequently disrupts. Winter crossings are not reliably possible, and the island has no airstrip, which means when the ferry isn't running, Ramea is effectively sealed. The town was founded in the late 18th century by English and Irish fishing families, and the fishing industry sustained it for over 2 centuries before the cod moratorium of 1992 devastated fishing communities across Newfoundland. The moratorium, imposed by the Canadian federal government in response to the near-total collapse of Atlantic cod stocks, was one of the largest layoffs in Canadian history, eliminating roughly 35,000 jobs in fishing and fish processing in Newfoundland and Labrador in a single announcement. Communities like Ramea, that had been entirely organized around cod fishing for generations, had no economic alternative waiting in the wings, and the population decline that followed was rapid and continues to this day. Ramea's population declined sharply after the moratorium, as it did in most similar communities, and the island has been trying to find a sustainable economic path ever since. One of the more unusual chapters in that search was a wind hydrogen energy project launched in the 2000s, in which Ramea was used as a test site for a hybrid wind and hydrogen power system designed to reduce dependence on diesel generation in remote communities. The project generated genuine scientific interest and was documented by researchers studying energy alternatives for remote northern communities, producing data that fed into broader discussions about renewable energy infrastructure in places too small and too isolated to connect to regional power grids. The community that remains in Ramea has the specific resilience of people who have made an active choice, repeatedly across generations, to stay somewhere that offers significant practical inconvenience in exchange for a particular kind of life. Author and Newfoundland native Wayne Johnston has written about the provincial isolation of communities like Ramea as representing a version of Canada that the rest of the country has largely forgotten exists, which is either a romantic description of stubborn survival or an accurate assessment of federal indifference to geographic periphery, depending on whether you're the one waiting for the ferry in February. Number 7. Meshchersky, Russia. Meshchersky is a small settlement in the Moscow Oblast that holds one of the stranger administrative distinctions in modern Russia. It is a closed settlement within what is officially a residential suburb of Moscow, meaning it sits geographically inside one of the most urbanized regions in the country while maintaining Zato-level access restrictions that would be more appropriate for a facility in the middle of Siberia. The settlement exists to house personnel associated with a military signals intelligence facility in the area, and its restricted status has been maintained continuously since the Soviet era. The existence of Meshchersky as a restricted settlement has been documented in Russian administrative records, but the specifics of the facility it protects and the nature of the work conducted there are not publicly available. What is known from Russian administrative sources is that the settlement has its own perimeter, its own access control, and its own resident population of personnel and families who live there because their work requires it, not because the real estate market in the Moscow suburbs made it the obvious lifestyle choice. The broader category of restricted settlements within suburban or urban areas is one of the more peculiar legacies of the Soviet administrative system. The USSR created hundreds of closed cities and settlements across its territory, and while many were opened or reclassified after 1991, a significant number remain in restricted status for reasons that current Russian authorities have chosen not to revisit. Meshchersky represents the specific subcategory of restriction that is genuinely invisible to the civilian population surrounding it. People drive past the perimeter fence on ordinary roads, going to ordinary destinations, without any real awareness that the settlement behind it operates under rules that apply to almost nowhere else in suburban Moscow. Number 6. Halfway, Oregon, USA. Halfway, Oregon is not forbidden in any governmental or security sense whatsoever. It has a population of around 300 people, a gas station, a couple of small businesses, and a location in the Eagle Creek Valley in eastern Oregon near the Hells Canyon Wilderness area that makes it one of the more isolated small towns in the Pacific Northwest. It earns a place on this list for a different reason. In 1999, the town of Halfway briefly renamed itself Half.com in a promotional deal with an online marketplace startup of the same name, becoming the first, and as far as anyone can determine, the only town in American history to rename itself after a website. The deal involved the company paying the town $50,000, providing 22 computers for the local school, and covering the cost of changing the town's signage and official stationery. In exchange, the town changed its official name to Half.com, Oregon, for 1 year, and the mayor at the time, Vicki Walker, who later went on to serve in the Oregon State Legislature, signed off on the arrangement with what local accounts suggest was a combination of practical financial reasoning and the awareness that nothing else quite like this had ever happened to a small town in Oregon before. Half.com, the website, was acquired by eBay in 2000 for around $300 million, was gradually absorbed into the main eBay marketplace platform over the following years, and was shut down entirely in 2017 when eBay decided the separate resale platform was no longer worth maintaining as a distinct service. The town reverted to Halfway after the promotional year ended. The computers remained in the school, and the story entered local memory as the time the town had its one moment of national attention and used it to buy a new computer lab. The episode appears in journalism courses and marketing textbooks periodically as an example of what creative publicity looked like before social media made the cost of viral attention essentially zero, and it serves as a reminder that in 1999, you could buy a nationally covered news story for $50,000 and 22 computers if you were willing to rename your town after a website. The town itself remains exactly as far from everywhere as it has always been. A small agricultural and ranching community at the end of a long drive through eastern Oregon, population 300, gas station, a couple of motels, and the specific character of a place that has learned to be comfortable with its own obscurity. Number 5. Priyutovo, Russia. Priyutovo is a zado in the Republic of Bashkortostan in Russia, associated with a military facility in the region that Russian authorities classify as sensitive infrastructure. Like most of Russia's closed cities, it maintains a security perimeter, requires FSB-issued permits for entry, and is not accessible to foreign nationals under any ordinary circumstances. The town has a population of several thousand residents who live there because their work, or their family's work, is connected to the facility the town was built to serve. What makes Priyutovo worth noting specifically is that it represents the sheer scale and persistence of Russia's closed city system, which at its peak during the Soviet era included over 40 designated closed cities with a combined population of over 1 million people, plus hundreds of additional restricted settlements distributed across 11 time zones. The system was designed to compartmentalize the most sensitive military and industrial work from the general Soviet population, and it succeeded in that goal with remarkable completeness. There are documented accounts of people who grew up in closed cities and did not know, as children, that the rest of the Soviet Union was structured differently from the world they could see from their front window. The closed city was not presented as a restriction, but as a normal form of residential organization, which is the kind of ideological infrastructure that takes generations to dismantle even after the political system that built it has collapsed. The post-Soviet Russian government opened many of these cities after 1991, removing the Zato designation and allowing normal civilian movement in and out. But a meaningful number were maintained in restricted status for reasons that current Russian authorities have chosen not to revisit publicly. The criteria for what constitutes ongoing security significance have never been published in accessible detail, which means the list of currently closed cities has a degree of opacity that is either the result of genuine ongoing security needs or the result of bureaucratic inertia maintaining restrictions whose original justification has largely expired. In Russia, those two explanations are not always easy to distinguish from the outside, and the people inside closed cities like Priyutovo are not in a position to adjudicate the question on behalf of anyone who might want to know the answer. Number 4. Nikel, Russia. Nikel is a town of around 10,000 people on the Kola Peninsula in the far northwest of Russia, just a few kilometers from the Norwegian border, and its name comes from what it was built to produce, nickel. The Kola Mining and Metallurgical Company operates a smelting complex in and around nickel that has, for decades, been one of the most significant sources of sulfur dioxide pollution in the European Arctic, producing acid rain that has killed large areas of forest on both the Russian and Norwegian sides of the border and created a landscape around the smelter that environmental photographers have documented as one of the more visually dramatic examples of industrial contamination in the world. Nikel is not formally a closed city in the Zato sense, but access is complicated by its location in a border security zone. The area near the Norwegian-Russian border requires a special permit for Russian citizens from other regions, and foreign access to the border zone area is subject to separate security protocols that made the town functionally inaccessible for most of the Cold War era. Norway and Russia maintained what was one of the only stable and consistently peaceable Soviet-era land borders, partly because neither side wanted to compromise the economic relationship around nickel production and the practical coexistence that the border crossing at Storskog facilitated, and partly because the geography, Arctic tundra, extreme weather, the Kola Peninsula's specific remoteness, made aggressive posturing logistically expensive for both sides. The smelter at Nikel was partially shut down by its operator, Nornickel, in 2020, with the announcement that production would cease and shift to other sites in the company's network. The closure of the smelter raised questions about the town's economic future that mirror the situation of single industry company towns across the industrialized world when the primary industry decides to move on. What is a town of 10,000 people supposed to do when the one thing it exists to do is no longer being done there? The Norwegian government, which had been documenting the cross-border pollution from Nikel's smelter for decades, and had at various points offered technical assistance to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions, expressed qualified relief at the closure announcement, while noting that environmental recovery in the affected areas would take many years, regardless of when the emissions stopped. Norwegian journalist and Barents region specialist Thomas Nilsen has described the Nikel smelter's legacy as an environmental wound that won't heal quickly, regardless of when the source of the damage stops, which is an accurate summary of what decades of industrial-scale sulfur dioxide emissions do to an Arctic ecosystem. The forests on both sides of the border that were killed by acid rain don't come back on a human timescale, and the town that produced that pollution is now facing the specific kind of post-industrial uncertainty that the 21st century has distributed widely and resolved inconsistently. Number 3. Lop Nur, China. Lop Nur is not a town in the conventional sense. It is a dried-up salt lake in the Tarim Basin of Xinjiang in western China, and the surrounding restricted zone is one of the most comprehensively off-limits territories in the world. Between 1964 and 1996, China conducted 45 nuclear weapons tests at Lop Nur, making it the Chinese equivalent of Nevada's test site, or Kazakhstan's Semipalatinsk, a piece of geography permanently associated with the most consequential weapons program of the 20th century. The town of Milan, officially known as Base 21, was built in the desert nearby to house the personnel of the nuclear test program. Scientists, engineers, military staff, and their families. And it operated as a closed military settlement throughout the testing period and afterward. Access to the entire Lop Nur region requires military authorization that is not available to civilian visitors of any nationality, and the Chinese government does not permit independent access to the test site area or the surrounding settlement infrastructure. The area is administered by Xinjiang's military command, and the consequences for unauthorized entry are not ambiguous. The environmental legacy of 45 nuclear tests in the Tarim Basin is a subject that Chinese authorities have not addressed publicly in any comprehensive way. Studies conducted by foreign researchers using available data, including work published by scientists at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory and by Japanese researchers using declassified Soviet-era data, have suggested that the tests caused significant radiation exposure in surrounding communities, including among the Uyghur and Kazakh populations of the broader Xinjiang region who lived downwind of the test site during active testing years. The Chinese government has contested these findings, and independent environmental assessment of the test site and its surrounding area has not been permitted. The lakebed of Lop Nur itself, which was used as a navigation point by Silk Road traders for centuries before drying up in the 1970s as the Tarim River was diverted for agriculture, has become an almost mythical geography in Chinese exploration and scientific circles. Explorer Sven Hayden mapped the area in the early 20th century, and the explorer Yu Chunshun died there, attempting a solo crossing of the dried lakebed in 1996, a death that prompted Chinese authorities to tighten access restrictions to the broader region even further. Epidemiologist and nuclear test researcher Dr. Jun Takada, who studied the Lop Nur tests extensively using publicly available data, described the testing program as one that operated in a zone of deliberate invisibility, and the access restrictions in place decades after the last test have helped maintain that invisibility effectively. Number 2. Raven Rock Mountain Complex, Pennsylvania, USA. Raven Rock Mountain is located in Adams County, Pennsylvania, about 7 miles north of the Maryland state line and about 6 miles from Camp David, and inside it sits one of the United States government's primary continuity of government facilities, a hardened underground complex capable of serving as an alternate Pentagon and command center for military operations in the event that the actual Pentagon becomes inoperable. The complex is officially known as the Raven Rock Mountain Complex, or RRMC, and its existence has been publicly acknowledged since at least the 1991 publication of journalist Richard Romer's work on continuity of government infrastructure. The facility was built beginning in 1948, carved into the granite of South Mountain, and was operational by 1953. It is designed to allow the Department of Defense and the Joint Chiefs of Staff to continue functioning after a nuclear strike on Washington, and it is equipped accordingly. Its own power systems, its own water supply from underground sources, its own independent communications infrastructure capable of operating when surface networks have been destroyed, and enough internal capacity to house thousands of personnel for an extended period without resupply. The facility has been periodically updated and expanded since its original construction, and its current capabilities significantly exceed what was installed in the 1950s. The computing, communications, and monitoring infrastructure has been modernized across multiple upgrade cycles, while the granite mountain around it remains the primary structural protection it always was. The town of Blue Ridge Summit, the nearest civilian community to Raven Rock, is a small Pennsylvania village with a post office and a handful of local businesses, and no formal connection to the facility other than the accident of geography. The mountain itself is off limits. The perimeter is marked and enforced by security patrols that are not casual about their responsibilities, and the access roads leading toward the facility are gated in ways that communicate clearly that visitor curiosity is not a recognized category of authorized business. Author Garrett Graff, who wrote a comprehensive history of American continuity of government infrastructure titled Raven Rock, the story of the U.S. government's secret plan to save itself, described the complex as the shadow government's home base, a facility so comprehensively designed for a specific catastrophic scenario that its existence is one of the more unsettling things a democracy can contemplate. The complex continues to be maintained at full operational readiness, staffed, supplied, and monitored continuously, which means whatever is inside that mountain is ready to go the moment it's needed. And whoever decided it needed to be that ready made that decision a long time ago and has been paying for it ever since. Number 1. Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture Border Zone, China. The border region between China's Yanbian Korean Autonomous Prefecture in Jilin Province and North Korea is one of the most consequential and most restricted border zones in the world, for reasons that have nothing to do with military capability and everything to do with what the border represents to the people on both sides of it. The Chinese side of this border, particularly the townships and villages in the hills above the Tumen and Yalu rivers, has been a key transit zone for North Korean defectors attempting to reach third countries since the North Korean famine of the 1990s, and the Chinese government has maintained a security posture in the area designed to prevent that movement rather than facilitate it. The specific villages and border townships in this region operate under security arrangements that are significantly more intensive than what applies to ordinary Chinese rural communities. Surveillance cameras are concentrated heavily along the border corridor. Police checkpoints on roads leading to the river crossings are routine, and the presence of both Chinese border police and North Korean security agents operating on the Chinese side, the latter through informal arrangements rather than any official bilateral protocol, means that defectors who make it across the river face a second layer of security before they can move inland. The Korean-Chinese border community in Yanbian includes a significant ethnic Korean population, the Joseonjok, or Korean Chinese, who have lived on the Chinese side of the border for generations, and their presence creates a social network that has historically provided refuge and assistance to defectors moving through. The Chinese government's response to that social reality has been to apply pressure to that community specifically, monitoring communications, requiring hotel operators and landlords to report any unfamiliar Korean-speaking guests, and in documented cases detaining ethnic Korean Chinese residents suspected of providing assistance to defectors. The organizations that help defectors navigate from the Chinese border to eventual safety in South Korea or a third country operate through a network that human rights organizations, including Amnesty International and Liberty in North Korea, have documented in detail over years of work with people who completed the journey. The route typically requires months of movement through China, often hiding in sympathetic households before reaching a country, most often Thailand or Mongolia, from which South Korea will accept a defector's application. The average cost of hiring guides for the full route from the Tumen River to a country of safety has been estimated at several thousand US, an amount that represents years of income for most North Korean families, and one that requires financial arrangements that extend the network of people at risk on both sides of the border. Journalist and Yanbian chronicler Barbara Demick, whose book Nothing to Envy documented the lives of North Korean defectors and the communities they passed through, described the Chinese border zone as a place where the geography of freedom and the geography of capture overlap so completely that it's impossible to say which one you're standing in, which is as accurate a description as any of what it means to live in a border zone where crossing in the wrong direction carries consequences that most people can barely imagine. If you found this one worth watching, hit like and subscribe. There's a lot more out there that isn't on the map.